Hello and welcome to this week's World Discord podcast. He's Joel Ostrow.
He's Brian Endless, unfortunately.
Yeah, thanks. I would just say the same thing about you, but I was being
course.
polite. I don't know why I'm polite with you. It actually never works and makes absolutely no sense, so I need to stop. And speaking of politeness, we're going to talk about diseases today, which are always incredibly polite. We have seen a lot. So I tell my students on a regular basis, Joel, we're all going to die. It's just a question of what kills us. So, sometimes
And when.
Exactly. Sometimes it's a stray meteor that hits the planet. Sometimes you get hit by a bus. Sometimes it's a nuclear weapon. Sometimes it's war.
Sometimes you get bored to death by political science professors.
It's true. And sometimes it is not getting your inoculation for the measles virus or a variety of other things that are now spreading across the planet. Unfortunately, we've seen infectious disease spread that keeps going and keeps getting worse in a lot of different places in the world. Yeah. And it has led to a lot of discord, and it's fed by conflict and leads to conflict, and all sorts of bad things happen with diseases. So we have an expert with us today who's joined us before, and I will let you welcome her back.
We're joined by my dear friend Katie Suleta, holds a PhD in public health, she's expert on a whole bunch of shit.
That was a good introduction. I'm sure I couldn't have found that any place in her online bio to do any better than that.
Actually, that's how you should describe yourself. Katie Suleta, Dr. Katie Suleta is expert on a whole bunch of shit.
That is how I describe myself constantly.
Pretty much. Besides being, an expert rock climber, mountaineer, also virologist, infectious disease expert, public health expert, disinformation expert. I think that's what we had you talking about before with effects of disinformation and misinformation and how it's connected to conflict. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I thought we talked about rock climbing before. That was that's what I thought
cool.
I came here to talk about was that.
Yeah. yeah. Different podcast, rock climbing and frisbee golf.
Yeah.
Our last episode was on the connection between climate change and conflict. And I recently read an article that was talking about the current outbreak of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which I flippantly often say is not democratic. It's questionable if it's a republic, and some people even dispute whether it's Congo. But how conflict, the long-running conflict there is escalating as this Ebola outbreak is escalating. There's all sorts of reasons for both, but I was hoping we might explore a little bit the connection between those, and then maybe more generally what experts see as the outlook for the future of diseases, how they might spread, what might happen as a result of the warming planet. I saw an article today about zombie viruses coming from the melting permafrost.
The permafrost stuff.
Yeah, and some questions as to whether that is just alarmism or whether there is real potential for things that might spin out of control. So. But maybe, Katie, you can start off with telling us a little bit about what's going on with this most recent Ebola outbreak, what it is, why it is, what's different about it, and we can go from there.
Yeah, so the Ebola outbreak that's currently going on, so there are kind of 4 Ebola viruses or viruses that are responsible for Ebola-like disease. This one is the Bundibugyo. Sorry, I never know I can't pronounce it very well, but that doesn't mean that I don't know at least like the high-level things about it. It's named for a region actually in Uganda, and what's going on with it is after the really, really big Ebola outbreak that happened in Western Africa about 10 years ago, we kind of went all in on trying to develop a vaccine. And so there is actually a vaccine against Ebola virus, but that's not what we're actually combating here. This is a different this is a different strain. And so we don't actually have a vaccine for this particular virus.
Can I interrupt you there? Is it a different disease, or is it more like COVID? or influenza where it's different strains, or is this actually not Ebola?
So it's a form of Ebola, and there are like 4 different forms. You can have Thai forest, you can have Sudan, you can have Ebola virus, which was the original one that was identified, that originally came out of like what we think of as DRC now. Used to be Zaire, so you might have heard it called the Zaire kind of strain of the virus. But we are now looking at a 4th different kind right now, and there is no vaccine against it. And so like the fact that there's no vaccine against it, after that really big Ebola outbreak in Western Africa about 10 years ago, like I said, we went all in on trying to develop a vaccine against it. And so that vaccine does work in the way that they do vaccines now. Is if there's an Ebola virus outbreak, they'll do what's known as kind of ring vaccination. So they will vaccinate anybody that was a known contact of somebody that was ill with Ebola. They won't just go ahead and vaccinate the entire public, because they don't have enough vaccines for the entire public. So they just do that ring vaccine. So you basically do contact tracing. So you go and you try to find anybody that had contact with someone that was a confirmed case of Ebola or a suspected case, and then they will vaccinate those individuals. Now, what's going on with this one is there's no vaccine for it. And so it's just kind of running rampant right now. And it went undetected for so long that by the time it was kind of on everybody's radars, it was already really bad. It was in a very rural region, and it was in a region that, Joel, as you were just talking about, the conflict has been getting worse. And so it's been harder for people like MSF, for example, or the WHO, or anybody that's kind of working on global health stuff to kind of access those areas. Now, there's also kind of the social aspect of this, which is it's very stigmatizing. There are a lot of different reasons for that, and I'm not here to necessarily deconstruct that, right? That's a really complicated question. And there's a lot that goes into that, especially around, say, disinformation, around kind of where Ebola comes from, what happens if you get sick with it. And, a lot of times too, there's just a lot of conspiracy theories around, especially if you get sick with it, people come and take you away, oftentimes a lot of white people, and then people are never seen again, right? And so it kind of plays into a lot of unfortunate stereotypes, but also like there's some truth in some of these things too. And so
Katie, let me stop you for a second. I want to break down 2 things that you're talking about. I do want to get back to the stigma in 1 minute, but before we do that, let's just talk about Ebola specifically and the health effects. I know the first strain of Ebola was arguably one of the deadliest viruses ever. If you got it, death rates were incredibly high. Is that still true with the current strain? Is it better? Is it worse? How does that compare, and how deadly is this one?
It's quite high. It's very high. And so this one is, let's see, so far there have been over 1,000 cases, and we're looking at hundreds of deaths already. And actually, I haven't looked at
3,000 cases.
Yeah, it's well over, and we might actually be at over 1,000 deaths now. It's actually been it's been like a week since I checked, but we might be at over 1,000 suspected deaths at this point. But also, it's been hard to count because again, it's been so. And we will obviously get into this. This is part of why I'm guessing you guys wanted to talk today. But like one of the things that the United States used to help do was do contact tracing and literal case counting. And so it's hard to actually pin down a number when we had pulled funds from kind of disease surveillance and throwing people on the ground at those kinds of problems whose entire job it was to go and track down cases. And to try to get a handle on how bad an outbreak is. And so we're getting ideas of how bad it is, but we're very much playing catch up. And like, yes, in some ways, disease surveillance is often a story of playing catch up. But part of, what I'm trained in public health is trying to prevent stuff, not playing catch up all the time. Like sometimes you're going to, and that's just kind of the name of the game when it comes to these kinds of diseases where you have spillover. You're going to be playing catch up in some ways, but there are better ways for us to be playing catch up, and there are some ways that we can give ourselves some advantages so that we're not caught on our back foot.
And we don't support the WHO anymore, right? So that it's not just that we're not doing the counting; we're also not supporting others who do the counting.
Yes,
that's true, still, right?
Yes.
So I know, again, past numbers, and correct me if these are wrong, early outbreaks, it was like 50% deadly for people who had it. And then if you came in physical contact with it, it was extremely contagious, but it was a physical contact thing. Is that accurate? Is that still accurate?
Yeah, it's so it's not airborne, right? So it's not something that we would think of as being a respiratory virus. You have to come into contact with bodily secretions, so saliva, vomit, diarrhea, all of those kinds of things, right? It has to be something like that. Um, but if you come into contact with those things, then unfortunately, yes, there is a good chance that you're going to come down with it. So it is good that it's not a respiratory illness,
Right.
because that does mean that it's harder to contract. You just have to be in more physical, like in closer physical proximity to somebody in order to contract it, which is something that actually does kind of work in our favor. However, then we have to start talking about things like cultural burial rights.
Yep.
Right? That becomes a really big kind of component in talking about what's going on and what's kind of perpetuating the spread. But also, people might not even know that they're sick yet. They might just feel like slightly under the weather, right? Unfortunately, there are so many things where when you get sick, it's just flu-like symptoms at first.
Yep.
And so it doesn't seem that bad. So you're still around people.
And now that takes us full circle to where you were before. I don't want to downplay the stigma side at all, because I know African politics very well, and enough about the way that healthcare comes into this. Stigma is incredibly important, especially, you mentioned some of the cases, but these are people who, for the most part, are living in dire poverty. They're not necessarily going to know they have it. And the stigma is such that even if they think they might have it, they're not going to want to tell anyone, because worst case, they're treated like they have the plague and they're kicked out. Best case, they don't have any real chance at treatment, especially if they're in a rural area, and they have to be taken away by white people and die with their family not allowed to be around them because it's so contagious. So all of these things lead into the stigmatization that make it harder to treat it because of the local conditions, and in particular, not just culture, but poverty is the biggest one.
Yeah, that's a really big one. And, I think in kind of the sector that I've really shifted into in the last, half dozen years or so, science communication is really, really, really important. But it's not just science communication. It's also working within a local community to understand like what some of those missing pieces are, and to gain trust. And so science communication, you can tell people until you're blue in the face of like, here are the facts on the ground. But if people are not ready to hear that, or if they have other reservations where they're just not interested in listening to you, then facts don't really matter. And so understanding what the hangups are is really, really important here. And one of the things that we used to do is, one of the ways that we used to kind of support the WHO is some of that work. Like, we're supposed to have people on the ground in these places that understand the culture, that come from the culture, that are local, that understand kind of like what the hangups might be, but we don't have those connections really anymore. And so we're having
we don't
to
even
start
have the diplomatic ones because we've slashed the foreign service. So I mean, I don't know that we ever had a very strong presence in DRC, but I'm assuming whatever's there is less than it used to be.
I mean, USAID had presence kind of all over that part of Africa. And Brian, this is something that we had talked about before, especially with HIV stuff. But with DRC having been such a conflict zone for the last 20, 30 years, and even beyond that, like it's hard to get in there. So oftentimes the main kind of source of that stuff would have come from MSF, right? Medicine Sans Frontières, or Docs Without Borders, as we know it in English. And even that's been hard. And there have been workers that have been killed because of kind of like the conflict that's escalating, and also the stigmatization, and, those two things coming together, unfortunately.
It's the most likely place in the world for aid workers to be killed, actually. It's a horrible situation. And then on the U.S. side, too, many people don't realize DRC is the size of the U.S. west of the Mississippi, and the capital, Kinshasa, is where L.A. is. That's where most of the U.S. diplomatic presence would be, and the disease is in the far east. So think, L.A. to St. Louis as far as the distance, and a big jungle in between. So it's just not easy to have a presence there when we wanted to have a presence there.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also one of those things where, you also have to have good relations with Uganda because of where it's at, and because there have been some spillover cases into Uganda. And so it's not just DRC, but you also have to understand kind of how those borders intersect with each other and how people are likely moving between countries, which is also why, having a presence in the WHO is so important, why having the CDC at full strength is so important, why having USAID is so important, because diseases don't respect boundaries. They don't respect international borders. They will get out. We've seen this with like Mpox. We've seen this with COVID. We've seen this with Ebola. We've seen this time and time and time again. And yet we continue to kind of act politically as though infectious diseases have this hard cutoff of like, oh, well, you got to the border of Uganda, but like, you're not going to get into Rwanda. You're not going to get into Tanzania. You're not going to go into Kenya. You're not going to go, you're going to stop at that border, because that border, not porous. That's not how it works, right? And so it's been really frustrating to kind of watch politically as the United States has made all of these very isolationist choices around what are essentially global health threats. And they are really, they are security concerns. They're being framed as something else, but they are global health threats that are security concerns, that like what's going on in the heart of Africa has everything to do with what is also going on in the United States.
Well, can you talk about that a little bit? Like can you speak a little to how the arrows work between the outbreak and the conflict and the outbreak? Like, how do those two things feed on each other to make each other worse, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, when you have conflict, one of the first things that will happen is, and you guys being in political science, oftentimes, before kind of modern warfare, the thing that would kill off most people during wars was disease.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're seeing happen, right? That's the first thing that you will see is healthcare goes out the window because people don't have access to it. Mm-hmm. And when you don't have access to healthcare, vaccines, right, prevention, people get sick. So that's why oftentimes in conflict zones, you see cholera outbreaks. So you're seeing that in DRC too. You see that in Yemen. You see that in all of these conflict zones. You see these diseases that you kind of think of as being really archaic almost, where it's like, we just don't really think about them. But as soon as you start to talk about conflict, that stuff pops back up immediately.
Well, Brian, you might know this, like the earlier Ebola outbreaks, were they in different areas that were further away from the active fighting? Is that one thing that's making this...
Most of it has been in Eastern Congo, just in different places in Eastern Congo. So Eastern Congo, the conflict area in Eastern Congo runs from the Burundi border to the south up into halfway up the Ugandan border to the north across the Rwandan border. So there are a number of different zones that it's hit. I think this is the farthest north that it's hit, Katie. Usually the last one that was further south. Yeah.
For this strain, I mean, there was a smaller Ebola outbreak that happened a few years ago that got into Tanzania. Somebody ended up in Dar, but yeah, I mean, from what I know, it might be the farthest north in DRC. I mean,
right, in DRC.
If we're talking, right. Yeah, if we're talking about that big one that happened 10 years ago, then we have to talk West Africa, right?
Right.
But yeah, I think it might be the furthest north. I'd have to fact check that. But sounds
to be clear, though, everything in the east is conflict driven by conflict minerals and driven by Rwandan and to a lesser extent Ugandan influence in Congo and keeping the conflict running and in supporting groups in Congo. And that makes the disease even worse because there's so much complication in the politics there, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so even, it's one of those things where, Ebola having a spillover event, you're always going to be playing catch up a little bit, but you can detect it a lot faster and you can prevent the spread a lot more if you know that it's happening, or if you can get to those areas because they're not conflict zones. And so it's really hard, that big Ebola outbreak that happened 10 years ago that I keep referencing. One of the things that fed into that was it got into other conflict zones. And that was like one of the reasons why it spread so much, right? And so it's one of those things where conflict makes disease management so much harder. And you have to start talking about things like vaccine diplomacy and having pauses in the fighting in order to go vaccinate people. Now, again, we don't have a vaccine for this one yet. But that does have to come into the equation at some point. And like, I know we've probably mentioned Gaza the last time we were talking, but there were pauses in the fighting between Gaza and Israel in order to go vaccinate people in Gaza against polio. And it's like that is a wild kind of feat if you think about that, of
Right.
like
Yeah.
we can't get a peace treaty, but we can pause the fighting for long enough to
Right.
go vaccinate.
That's actually
Which is
fascinating to me.
ironic, even the
Yeah, that's something the WHO working with UNICEF perfected.
Yeah.
It was back in the 70s, 80s when we started to get all the childhood vaccinations. They figured out how to get warlords and differing leaders to stop conflict for a day so they could have a vaccination day. And that really continues to this day. And people actually care enough, except in the United States, of course, people actually care enough about vaccinating their kids that even warring factions are willing to take that pause. And it is amazing to see that. You're absolutely right.
It's amazing. I mean, even during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union partnered in order to do vaccine research.
Yep.
Even
And distribution, right? Smallpox, polio,
Yes, at the height of political tension, when everybody was so worried about nuclear war, you have these crazy nations that hate each other that are absolutely working together in order to do vaccine research and to roll out these vaccines for people. Like it's the one thing that it's like we might be able to cut through some of the like atrocities that are going on in order to get people healthcare. It's like the one thing that we can maybe do, but it's falling apart in the United States. And the United States has played such an important role in this process for the world that like we're seeing global impacts of it.
And as you said, those damn little viruses don't respect borders. And that's really the central piece of it. I want to look very quickly too at treatment. Is it correct? There's no treatment right now other than your basic prophylactic stuff, liquids and rest and things like that.
Supportive
I
care,
read today that there is a trial for this strain that's starting to be administered.
So there are a couple of different vaccines that are currently being investigated and in trials. They're actually looking at the Ebola vaccine right now to see if it has any overlap at all, to see if like maybe they could do something until they can actually design a vaccine that is specific to this strain. So they are doing that, but that's one of the hard things right now is there's nothing but supportive care and there's no vaccine. So there's no treatment and there's no prevention other than doing contact tracing and trying to just chase down all of the contacts to make sure that like anybody that's had contact then has to go into isolation. And like that's also not a very fun message to give to people, right? We just saw this with the hantavirus stuff that happened in May. Like you tell people that they have to isolate because they might have been potentially exposed to an infectious disease. People are not going to be happy, right? We saw this with COVID. We just had a whole panic about it with hantavirus. Like I was saying, like people are not happy about it. And especially if you tell them that they've potentially been in contact with something as deadly and scary as Ebola, that's also as stigmatized. You have quite the uphill battle in front of you.
And a piece of that too is people are just getting by on subsistence level farming if they're getting by, and you take out one of those people in that loop and an entire family could starve if somebody has to go into isolation.
But we talk about those past efforts like during wars of sort of suspending fighting to allow for vaccination. I don't know if there's historical precedents for pausing fighting to allow for care when disease spread. But even if there were a vaccine, on the one hand, the situation either during the Cold War, in the past, or in the Israel-Gaza war, the aggressors were more established organized governments that played the game of war according to the rules of war. And this conflict, like one reason it's been so persistent for so long is that doesn't describe the entirety of Africa's world war. As it's sometimes known, there are so many different groups that make it so confusing. It's one reason that I don't try to make sense of it because my brain starts to hurt. But it's hard to get all those groups to agree to stop, and it only takes one to not stop for there to not be a pause.
Right. You aren't just going to the government of DRC and being like, hey, can you just dial it down for a couple of days? And then going to the government of Uganda and saying, hey, can you just dial it down for a couple of days? That's not what's going on, right?
Even Ukraine and Russia can pause to allow for exchange of of dead or prisoners, right? Like, because again, it's a government to a government, but it's much more difficult. Can I turn a little bit maybe you can educate us a little on Ebola and how it's different. I've never heard, like, I remember even, what was it, 15 years ago with Zika, people were talking about that as a climate change kind of virus. Um, uh, Even people were talking about COVID as perhaps being more spreadable in part because of climate, or how it might, how it might not be seasonal anymore. And I remember discussion of whether seasonal viruses would even be a thing with climate change. Does Ebola have anything at all? Like, given the way it spreads, my hunch is the answer is no. Does it have any connection to climate change in terms of the virus itself?
Of course. I mean, we have to talk about climate change because we are having such an impact on the world around us that, for example, we're going more into the forest. We're going deeper into the forest. Deforestation plays a really big part in this. Deforestation also makes it more likely for people to, say, interact with animals that have a virus that might then spill over into people. So the more, like, we have to talk about climate change here because that's the direct cause of a lot more spillover events. Like COVID, we knew COVID was going to happen. Now, did we know it was the exact virus? No, but like, if you had talked to anybody in infectious disease, they would have told you, like, yes, climate change is absolutely fueling infectious disease outbreaks and zoonosis because we are coming into contact with more of these animals that we normally wouldn't, or we are in places that we normally wouldn't be, which means we are also being exposed to pathogens that we've never been exposed to. And some of them are going to take in humans. That's
And
just
different
how it
species
works.
are moving, right? There's different species of mosquito that are moving beyond what used to be their range.
Yep. And
Do
like,
we
so
know?
yeah, I mean, I was just in Los Angeles and everybody was complaining about how they have mosquitoes now. They didn't used to have mosquitoes. And so now with the introduction of mosquitoes, now you have to start talking about things like dengue and West Nile. And depending upon the species of the mosquito, maybe even malaria at some point. Like you have to start talking about all of this stuff again, which is a real big bummer, right? To say the least. Like we had beaten a lot of this stuff back, but also, man, we're now going to have to start thinking about different ways to go about it because climate change is making places that used to be inhospitable for a lot of these disease vectors more hospitable.
Do we know the origin, the original vector for Ebola? I don't personally, I haven't heard what it is. I don't know if we found it or not.
So there's still conversations about it. So we don't have the exact one, but there is strong evidence that it's a species of bat that is likely. Now, we don't know if that's like the actual vector, if it just plays a role, but there's strong evidence for that. And it's been a minute since I actually looked at that literature, but the last time that I looked at it, we didn't have the actual answer yet, but there was really good reason to believe that it had to do with a bat.
Okay.
What are the particular worrisome diseases that people are worried about as time moves forward? And I'm speaking specifically, the recent warnings about, the past very conservative predictions about climate change now being realized as having been too conservative. Mm-hmm. Are there particular worrisome diseases that we're not prepared for, that the scientific community is talking about that maybe we're not so aware of?
Oh yeah. So, and I think you can even talk about the United States and kind of what's going on here. So, for example, leishmaniasis is a really good example of this. Mm-hmm. Leishmaniasis is pretty nasty.
I've never heard of them.
So it used to basically only
sounds maniacal.
It's real bad, and it used to only be found in kind of deserty regions. We had kind of beaten it back. We had figured out ways to prevent it. It's transmitted, so there are two different strains of leishmaniasis. One of them is transmitted through essentially a sandfly, and we had figured out ways of doing kind of vector control around that stuff. But guess what? We're now seeing it in Texas, and we're seeing it in Europe, and like we've seen it in Greece. Yeah, we've seen it in Greece. I think we saw it either in Sardinia or maybe Sicily. Maybe it was Sicily. So we're starting to see it pop up in places where like you do not want to be seeing that pop up, and it's really nasty. Think in sort of common parlance, think like flesh eating.
Yeah.
It's not great. It's real. It can be very disfiguring. It's really hard to treat once you actually have it. I think another big one that we should be talking about in the United States is screwworm. So that's not necessarily a human thing, but that is one that the United States had worked with several governments of North and Central America and even South America to try to beat back, right? That's a problem for our livestock and our animals.
Yeah.
And all
That
of a
was
sudden,
Texas or Oklahoma where they had to destroy a whole bunch of.
And we had worked for years on beating screwworm back, and it wasn't an issue for us. And we had been working with so many governments within Central America and South America, I think even all the way down to Colombia. And like it was still a problem in South America and in certain parts of Central America. But the whole point was we had been going all in on trying to make sure that this thing didn't come back, and it didn't come back through Central America all the way up to us. And we are now seeing it. And like that could be a really big problem for, say, Texas and Oklahoma and all of the like cattle producing states that have like a lot of livestock. That's going to be a really big issue.
Does it kill the animals, or does it?
Yes, it can.
Those animals?
Yeah, so it essentially is. It's a little insect that gets into open wounds in animals and makes it even worse. And so if you've seen any very grisly pictures, it can basically look like an animal has like a huge hole in its side because the screwworms can basically just like they eat the animal. And so they're like eating it and you can see it from the outside, and it's just like an enormous gaping wound. And it's, obviously you're talking about lost money and you're talking about lost food. And that also has impacts on people. So we're not necessarily talking about the direct danger to people for a disease, but we are not getting sick, but that also has
we might get hungry.
Yes, right. And this is again part of climate change stuff. And also we have taken away our investment from these kind of global threats.
Climate change because the worms are moving north to escape the heat? Is that?
So part of it is a lot of the cuts that had kind of come down through the health side of the United States government, for example, were starting to trickle down. And at some point it was just kind of like, do we need this screwworm stuff? And the answer was always, yes, we do. And we need to be going all in on it. And we just weren't. And now it's here, and now we're really trying to go in on it. Like, the states that started complaining about it are getting some relief, but we shouldn't have ever seen it come all the way up through Mexico. Like, we should have just kept going with the things that we were doing. But, there were so many cuts that happened when the Trump administration took office last year through DOGE, and so many of them had to do with more isolationist policies that like stuff like this is just going to happen, where it's like, well, if the thing that you want to do is say that the United States is our own little island and that we don't interact with people, the way that we can prove that is not true is through little buggies that are coming across our border in both people and animals. And so it's just, yep. I think it's one of those things where it's like, yes, this is a direct climate change thing. And like, we need to be addressing it as such, and we need to be addressing it, the reality of it as such, but we also need to be addressing it as kind of the reality of kind of disease and pest control across borders as these pests continue to kind of like, unfortunately, the worst animals are the ones that are also really hardy.
Right. Can I ask the last question on this score?
Two things real quick before that. Okay. First, Joel, if we keep having shows like this, we're never going to get those ads from the Meat Council or from the government. They're just not going to advertise with us. That's going to be a significant problem. So we need to think about it. Screwworm, it's what's for lunch. And second, I may preempt your question here, Joel. I'm sorry. The other thing that I'd heard about a couple of years ago that hasn't happened yet, I'm pretty sure, is the possibility that bird flu would evolve and actually be transmissible from human to human. Because right now you can only get it by eating flesh or droppings or things like that. But the possibility that when a human got it, they could transfer it was huge if that ever happens.
Yeah. So bird flu is still... Man, it's scary. Last year we had a pretty bad scare, and a really bad scare. And
Lost a lot of songbirds here.
And we had a really bad scare, and in Colorado, where I live, there were quite a few people that got sick, and
Mhm.
it's one of those things where normally this would be something that the CDC would be all over, and it was something that we very much just kind of left to the states
Yeah.
and kind of whatever you can kind of do about it. And it's, the flu, like bird flu in particular, but just influenza and the different strains of it are something that we usually are actively trying to monitor, and we're trying to not be on our back foot about, which is why we
Right.
have a flu vaccine and why we've got vaccine panels about it, and like which strains are circulating in South America, so that we can kind of try to make our best guess for what might happen in North America during flu season, while also watching kind of what's going on in livestock. So not just birds, but also we would have to be talking about what's going on with other animals too, horses, cattle, etc. But we're just pretending like that's not really a problem.
We conveniently forget that before we could treat it, influenza was the number one killer in the world. That you get influenza, it turns into pneumonia, and you die. And the same thing happens if you don't catch influenza quickly enough, especially for older and younger and infirm people. It is a killer. It's a really a bad thing.
It's really bad. And I mean, I'm going to date myself, but like back in 2009, I worked on the swine flu pandemic. If people remember the swine flu pandemic, it was kind of a near miss for us, where we did get a vaccine rolled out very quickly, but it was a very funny strain that wasn't just taking out the really old and really young. It was also taking out at the time people my age, and I was in my 20s when that happened. And it was because we had never, my kind of generation had not been exposed to that particular strain. And so it was making people in their 20s and 30s very sick. And thankfully, like, we were able to pivot very quickly. But now, if that happens, especially in the next however many years that we are continuing to deprioritize infectious disease monitoring, surveillance, and research, we could have a really big problem on our hands.
Yeah.
We sort of know.
I do want to point out real quick, though, Joel, I love the fact that our distinguished guest thinks 2009 is dating yourself.
Yeah.
Guys, it was almost 20 years ago.
Yeah. Don't say that. Go ahead.
We know about flu, and we know that, people are familiar that different strains of it come, and they can be unexpected, and some are more deadly than others. But in connection with climate change, like I'm thinking of, I can't remember the name, there have been numerous films that have come out, like horror films about, some unknown brand new killer virus. Like, is that fantasy, or do people think and worry about that as well? Like, I asked what scientists are thinking about, and you mentioned ones we know about, but how do you think about things we don't know about? If that makes any sense.
Yeah. So what I will say is there are kind of a few different there are a few different categories of people that kind of work on this stuff. One is sort of the big diseases that everybody knows about, right? Influenza, HIV, et cetera, the ones that everybody knows about. But then you also have people who work on neglected tropical diseases, so things that you would primarily see kind of along the equator, and in places that are unfortunately experiencing, say, a lot of poverty. And so we call them neglected tropical diseases typically. And so like leishmaniasis is one of those things, and it's breaking out from places that were very impoverished, and that we thought of as kind of developing nations, but it's now coming to the United States again. We've had it in Texas. And so, and then there's kind of the third, which is more the hypothetical, but trying to be, I guess, more educated in the hypothetical of like, what could we be thinking about as far as like what's going to be the next big one. So again, the people that kind of work in the more hypothetical pandemic scenarios, there were plenty of people that understood that a coronavirus was very, very likely to be the next pandemic, and like would have put money on it. And that's not because they were the ones that designed it or anything. It's because they pay attention to how pandemics work and to what the characteristics of a virus are that would make it more likely to be able to become a pandemic and become a problem. And so there are a lot of people that are trying to figure out, what might be the next problem. But then you kind of, Joel, you're kind of alluding to like, what don't we even know? And There are people that will entertain that question. I personally find it to be terrifying, and so I won't entertain that question. But thankfully, there are people that are much smarter than me that are entertaining that question.
We're more warped, which is also hard to believe.
There's some great fiction about it. I mean, that The Last of Us is particularly scary because it just assumes that climate change makes the planet warmer and that a fungal virus can stay alive in humans when it couldn't before, and all of a sudden the world goes away. Joel, you mentioned melting ice caps, so we don't know what's under the ice caps.
Well, but that was before we started recording. Can you talk, like, there's been worry about these so-called zombie viruses, things that existed 40,000 years ago, that now that the Arctic ice and the permafrost are melting, are suddenly, perhaps becoming available, I guess. Or like, what
reactivated?
Can you talk about those at all? Like, do we know anything about any of those? Like,
I truly don't.
Biologists or virologists?
We're like very much operating outside of my realm of expertise here. I truly don't know. I mean, at this point, I think it's pure speculation, but it's possible is the thing. And that's what everybody's worried about, is like, well, it's not totally nuts. And if it's not totally nuts, like, what does that mean for us? And what could that mean for us? And, I think one of the things that was so interesting kind of about The Last of Us, or shout out to Max Brooks, if you've read World War Z, that book. What's so interesting about it is, it's about zombies, and essentially so is The Last of Us. But like, what's so interesting about that is a thought exercise is, if you kind of take apart the zombie thing and you truly just treat it like a pandemic, they did that, and it's really scary. And it isn't the Walking Dead thing that's scary about it. It's, I think, society's reaction to a new pandemic, to a new pathogen, and kind of what would happen, because it wouldn't just be that people were sick and dying, right? It would also be that we started to fall apart at the seams, and we saw that with COVID. We just went through this.
Yeah. Well, if people are listening to this and are thinking this is insane, when a part of the Siberian permafrost became more accessible, people found bones of woolly mammoths. Scientists were able to extract DNA, and there was talk about being able to sort of bring them back. And there have been a number of species I've read about over the years where there's been speculation that they could, through now modern techniques with gene splicing and stuff, that they could revive these extinct animals. If you can do that with a whole animal, you would think that viruses could also remain viable.
Well, the woolly mammoth thing is kind of funny because they can't actually bring back the whole animal, right? It would essentially be like a fuzzy elephant. Right, because there are limitations around, like, DNA degrades, and like, as much as I would love Jurassic Park to actually be a possibility, it's like not actually a possibility. So like, we can't do the whole elephant. Now, that being said, what's interesting about viruses is some of them are very hardy, and annoyingly so. And so for the most part, it's one of those things of like, well, we'd like to think that no, it's not possible, but also dumber things have happened. So it's just a question of, viruses are not, they're complicated, but they're not nearly as complicated as, say, an entire animal, where you'd have to have like the whole genome, or like the whole, whole animal in order to understand more about it. But a virus is a fairly simple organism, unfortunately.
As I remind people all the time with science, there's this book written in 1818 called Frankenstein, and we forget about it all the time when scientists take off and start doing stuff like this. What can go wrong?
What can go wrong? Yeah, I mean, I don't. Again, I'm not actually sure what would be possible with permafrost, and there would be people that are way more qualified to speak on that than I am. But for now, I think the main concern is really diseases that are already present that are shifting kind of where they're at geographically, and becoming more widespread, more present in, say, more populated areas than they've ever been before. And that's a real threat, and that's a real concern, because then how do you treat these things? And again, a lot of these things are also going to fall under the neglected tropical disease category, which the very first word, and that's in that category, is neglected. meaning we probably don't have great prevention or treatment for it.
Yeah. Well, and even you just look at things like malaria. If parts of the southern United States become tropical and malaria goes there, when Westerners went to tropical areas, they were killed by malaria because they had no exposure to it.
Yep.
And if we have no exposure to it, yeah, we've got, vaccines, but a lot of people are going to get very sick regardless and potentially die from that. Just something that's simple.
I mean, one of the best things that one of our biggest accomplishments, public health wise, in the United States was eradicating malaria from here. Like we only get imported cases, but also that might not be the case anymore.
Right.
And that's scary.
You're probably going to bite my head off, Katie, because now I'm going to really be talking about something that I think I know a little bit about, even though I know that I don't know anything about it. A few years ago, I read this book called Virolution. Have you ever encountered that?
I'm vaguely aware of it. I've not read it.
So it talks about like deep history viruses, like signatures of those bottleneck in human population causing viruses from deep in the past that are signatures that are present in our current DNA. And the thought is like the virus, people survived those bottlenecks. And the ones who survived are the ones who, for whatever reason, survived the infections, right? And then that immunity, if you will, got passed down through umpteen generations, and you can see the historical signals of these viruses in our current DNA. Again, I'm botching it, I know, but I do remember specifically that they were saying those bottlenecks were almost exclusively called by retroviruses, so viruses similar to HIV, but those were the really murderous ones. So I wonder, part of me thinks, well, if these zombie viruses that we would be worried about come back, do we need to be worried about them because we're already protected against them by virtue of being here?
I mean, I think the answer is yes, we still need to worry about them. I mean, absolutely. Because even if we had any sort of protection, like at this point, how far removed are we from it? And our immune systems are so naive to it. And I mean, honestly, you could probably make the same kind of argument for, say, the plague, for example. But
I'd rather not get it.
Well, and also I live in the southwestern United States where we get plague outbreaks here, and let me tell you about how people are not doing great with it.
Yeah. Plus, what I was saying almost sounds like the climate deniers. Oh, the climate's always changing. That kind of bullshit. So
Yeah. There's absolutely a through line there of oh no, it's fine if you get infected. It's actually better than if you get vaccinated, because then your immunity is better or whatever, or your immune system knows what to do when it comes across whatever ancient virus or whatever bacteria or what have you.
Brian's already got the title for this episode. Joel spews bullshit. Go ahead.
Exactly. So, Katie, before I let Joel spew some more bullshit in his final question, you, I think, had some books you wanted to plug that if people are interested, they should be looking at.
Yeah. Since we've talked about vaccine diplomacy, everybody should check out. So Peter Hotez is kind of one of the leading vaccine researchers in the world. He used to be the U.S. Science Envoy to North Africa and the Middle East. So he's worked directly in vaccine diplomacy. And actually on my bookshelf back here, he's got a book called Preventing the Next Pandemic. And if you're interested in, Joel, kind of what you were asking me about with climate change and conflict and how those things intersect and how they feed into disease outbreaks, that's what that book's all about. Shameless plug for it. It's really, 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 really good. And the work that he does is primarily in neglected and tropical diseases. He's down at Baylor in Texas. And so he was actually one of the few people who was working on a more affordable version of the COVID-19 vaccine to roll out in developing countries.
Nice. All right, Joel, you've got some kind of stupid question.
No, you get the stupid question this time.
All right, I'll take it. So, your magic wand, Katie, pull it out and tell us in the next couple of years, what should we be doing that we are not doing now in order to not die from infectious diseases as a person, as a society, whatever direction you want to go.
And eliminate MAGA can't be your answer.
Okay. Oh my God. everybody go get vaccinated for everything that you can.
Yeah.
Go get vaccinated. Go get vaccinated. Go get your flu shot. Go get your COVID shot. Go get your shingles shots. Go get make sure that you're up to date on your polio shot. Like, make sure you've got everything. Go get your HPV shots. Oh my God, if you are young enough to go get an HPV shot, go get an HPV shot. Make sure you've got your Hep B shots. Make sure you are up to date on your vaccines. The other kind of big thing that I would also say is, there's also, it sort of rhymes with the vaccine thing, is unfortunately we're also seeing this push with newborns to not to refuse a vitamin K shot in the United States. Yeah, and so it sort of rhymes with that. Please don't refuse vitamin K shots. They're really important, and they prevent a lot of unnecessary death in infants. So please get vaccinated, and don't refuse the vitamin K shots for your newborns. Those are kind of the main big ones that I will plug for people, is just whenever you get the opportunity, go talk to your doctor about getting vaccines for stuff. And unfortunately, vaccines might be more expensive because some types of insurance might not cover certain vaccines anymore. Now, it depends on where you live, and it depends on your insurance, and it depends on what schedule they're going after, they're following. The thing that I've been recommending to everybody is the American Academy of Pediatrics has a good vaccine schedule that you should still follow.
Right.
And so whatever is kind of going on with the CDC and HHS and all of the kind of various vaccine panels at the federal government level, I think the American Academy of Pediatrics is a really good place for people to get some information around vaccine schedules, especially for kiddos.
Yeah, that's excellent. You're actually giving the exact advice that I used to follow. I changed it a little bit in the last year or two, though. First, I just get the vaccines my doctor tells me to. He asked me, do I want this one? I said, I don't know. Do I want this one? You tell me. And then second, I started a new one. I just had a checkup last week, and my doctor completely agreed. My new policy is I do the opposite of everything RFK Jr. tells me.
Yeah, pretty much.
And my doctor agreed that's a pretty good policy to follow.
Yeah, just get vaccinated. I will say that kind of my last shtick is I'm really, I think at this point, probably most people understand what anti-vax actually looks like, which is not, a lot of people have kind of bought into the whole, well, these people aren't actually anti-vaccine. They're just hesitant, or they just have questions, and that's not true. They were never asking questions in good faith. They always had an agenda.
Hesitancy. Oh my God, I hate that phrase.
They always had an agenda, and so this is what anti-vaccine rhetoric looks like. And so please do not buy into kind of the glossy sheen that they're trying to put on it by, as I like to call it, jacking off, just asking questions. And it is anti-vaccine rhetoric. Don't fall for it. That's what it looks like. And just don't fall for it. Go get vaccinated, because hey, did you know that the measles are back with a vengeance? We're about to lose our measles elimination status. We would have already, had they not kicked the ball down the fields in order to kind of help some political allies. But we will lose our measles elimination status. We will, because of what's been going on. So go make sure you are up to date on all of your vaccines. Go get your DTaP. Go get your MMR. Do those things.
We'd like to thank everyone in the anti-vax community for the worst measles outbreak in decades. That's thank you very much. Katie, thank you incredibly for joining us. Fantastic information as always, things that I hope people are actually listening and following all the way through, because we need it. So we really appreciate your joining us. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much, you guys. Thanks, Statler. It was great to see you.
Thanks everybody for tuning in. Thanks, David, for producing, and we'll catch you next time on the World Discord podcast.
Bye, folks.